Alright everyone, at this point it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. We can bant all we want about Ukraine, but fundamentally it's delusional at this point to believe that Ukraine can win against Russia. A win in this sense would take the form of Ukraine and Russia fighting to a stalemate at some indefinite period, both realizing that they're not going to be able to achieve their entire mission statements, coming to a ceasefire and negotiating. During this negotiation, because Russia occupies a swath of Ukraine, but Ukraine does not occupy a swath of Russia to swap or something like that, what'll happen is that you'll end up with Ukraine losing land. About the only change that could possibly occur in Russia, which would maybe stop the situation and then Russia withdraws, is some sort of mass calamity that we're not necessarily expecting to happen. Also, Putin could get killed or he could die, but the party leadership would maintain the war. Again, people aren't understanding the culture of some of these nations in the world. Another reason why I wish that Trump were president right now, because this war never would have actually occurred in the first place. He had openly threatened Russia and said hands off, and Russia respected that. That's because power and prestige don't work the same way in Russia that they do in the Netherlands or in Canada or someplace like that. If you've pledged yourself to a war, you better fight through to completion, because otherwise you tend to end up getting overthrown and put in a gulag. That's sort of Russian history 101 for people. Ukraine has the same problem. Years ago, before this war popped off, Western legacy media was very honest about Ukraine. It would point out, hey, Zelensky's corrupt, and there's all this money laundering and human trafficking and weird shit happening over here. Ukraine is generally a corrupt country. It muzzles the media, which, whatever. And there's limited free expression and so forth in the nation, and it was admitted to. All those articles stopped being produced the second that Russia invaded Ukraine because, Putin man bad. And I'm against the existence of the war and wish it hadn't happened, and I do understand that Russia is the physical aggressor in this situation. Yes, Minsk Accords and all of these other things aside, the physical invasion beginning with Crimea, that's Russia. It just is. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war. But it's delusional to believe, the link in the description, archived of course, some of these so-called policy experts like Barbara Streisand, literally named in the article, by the way, it was penned here, and Sean Penn and people like that, begging Congress to allocate more resources. Well, if Ukraine can still win if you give them more weapons and money. Yeah, why not just give them some nuclear weapons? What could possibly go wrong? That'd be perfectly fine. It doesn't matter that Ukraine is fighting a defensive war and that you can sympathize with the people of Ukraine, especially people who are currently being kind of brutalized in the areas controlled by Russia, forced to participate in Russian elections. There are war crimes happening quite clearly. Well, when a Russian unit gets captured by the Ukrainians, they're not necessarily given their due process under the Geneva Convention either. Just pointing that out again, this is the tale of two relatively authoritarian states clobbering one another. But it's delusional to think that Ukraine, after a prolonged period of us upping the ante over and over and giving them more and more weapons and sophisticated systems and everything else, logistic support, fucking jets now, tanks, fuel, money, ammo, rockets, anti-tank missiles, everything under the sun, to the point where we've pumped them so full of military steroids it resembles a Eastern European version of Afghanistan, where you can get a crate of hand grenades for $40, by the way, still, because there's so many of them, they're basically worthless. That was due to the U.S. arming them back in the late 70s through the early 80s when the Soviets attacked them. It's delusional to think that they're somehow magically going to start pushing the Russians back, because they've been unable to do so far. Supposedly there was going to be a big spring offensive, you remember? Some time ago? Oh, there's going to be a big spring offensive, and the Ukrainians will drive them back, because they got Abrams tanks now and stuff like that. Didn't work. Russia can absorb the casualties. They simply have much more armor and air support. That's the long and short of it. Russia acts with impunity over the areas that it controls, generally speaking, and not too far behind the lines, the only risk is basically, hey, occasionally a drone gets through, or they fired a missile off, or something like that. Russia has a great deal of missiles. It also has allies that provide even more missiles and support. North Korea is supplying them. Iran has supplied drone platforms, etc., etc. By the way, Iran, God, one of the world leaders in drone production, I think. Yeah, they're one of the closest allies to the Russians. China, so far, has not gotten explicitly involved for the most part. Well, that would be a problem too, because China happens to have a lot of weapon systems as well, including modern fighter jets that are better than anything in the Russian arsenal. So, they could theoretically supply them at any time if they decide to ramp up their war machine. China, Russia, and Iran versus all of NATO. It would be a bloodbath for the Eastern Bloc if it weren't involving a proxy war. Because, we can't put U.S. troops into the mix, or NATO troops into the mix. It'd probably start World War III. So all we can do is send weapons to a nation which is slowly being economically and militarily depleted. It's effectively a waste of time. What we should have done from day one, well, first we should have just re-elected Donald Trump. So then the hope is that Putin would die during Trump's second term at some point, and this would maybe not happen. Maybe a different leader would come in and be more reluctant to bother and say, well, we got Crimea, we got plenty of warm water portage, let him join NATO, who gives a fucking shit, or something like that. That's a possibility. Somebody who's more detached, more like a Gorbachev or something like that than a Joseph Stalin. That would have been the first order priority, re-elect Donald Trump. And if we do re-elect him in the coming election, I have a feeling that diplomacy will break out there, and possibly in Korea, and things for at least another 4 years hopefully generally go smoothly. It's going to take a little bit of diplomatic effort because, of course, now Trump can't come in and bomb Moscow because Ukraine's already been physically invaded. But a diplomatic solution is the only way for the people of this region to win. The best thing you could do, cede some of that land to Russia, and make sure that there's an extraction of people that don't want to be part of Russia. So the Ukrainian-speaking admitted minority within that region would be repatriated into Ukraine. Maybe the Russians give them a stipend. The same for people that speak, Russian in parts of Ukraine. Say, well, we'll have an exchange, basically, in order to finalize this border. Russia wouldn't get all of the land that it holds in the end, and there would be a repatriation effort and stuff like that. That's the best case scenario. But the West is seemingly uninterested in conducting that sort of diplomacy. And once it showed that disinterest, Russia became disinterested as well. So nobody's really at the table. Yeah, they have talks once in a while. They go absolutely nowhere. But to believe that a country like Ukraine, with a second-tier military capability that's already been physically invaded and has to be propped up by half of the Western world, is capable of pushing back a nuclear power is delusional at this time. That's about all. Peace out.